All right, so remember, to do well in this course, you have to take a lot of really good notes. So if you haven't already, grab that sheet of paper and a pencil or pen. Please go ahead and do so now and write down these 4 sentences so we can talk about it. All right, so the first question I have for you is, what is an independent clause? Every time I've asked this question when I'm doing face-to-face classes, I've gotten 2 main responses. Most people will say that an independent clause is any sentence that has a subject and a verb, and they will be correct. And the second thing I heard is an independent clause must stand on its own, and that is also true. But for the purpose of this exam, I want us to add a third law or rule that you and I have to remember. We also have to have a sentence that is a full thought, a full idea. And to illustrate this, let me give you an example of something that may not be a full thought. For example, we could say Susan wants. So we have a subject, Susan, and a verb, wants. However, that's an incomplete thought because there's no context. It doesn't really have a real full idea behind it. So for the purpose of this exam, we'll make sure that our independent clauses have a subject and a verb. They have to stand on their own, and they must be complete sentences. So with that said, let's turn our attention to these 4 sentences that you wrote down. So the first one, she worked out. Is it an independent clause? She, subject, worked out, verb. Yes, and it's a full idea. Second piece, she went to class. Again, we have a subject, a verb, and a full thought. So both of these parts, the first and the second, would be independent clauses. Now, the million-dollar question is this. Are we allowed in English to separate 2 independent clauses using a comma? Now, every time I've asked this question in face-to-face settings, I get a pretty good mix of yes and no's. So if you say yes, that's understandable. If you say no, that's also understandable. But I want us to settle this once and for all and agree that we never will ever again separate 2 independent clauses using a comma. That is a big error that actually has a name in English. That is an error known as a comma splice, when you put a comma where it does not belong, and that's something that we will never ever do now that we know we shouldn't do that ever again. So that begs the question, what then can we do to join 2 independent clauses? So we're going to go over 4 ways we can correctly punctuate 2 independent clauses. This is just a basic introduction. Each punctuation we will spend a little bit of time just going over so you have a full understanding of how to use it in the future. So first things first, if you have an independent clause on the left and another one on the right, you can definitely separate those 2 using a period. The second way you can correctly punctuate 2 independent clauses is using a semicolon. So remember, with a semicolon, you have to have an independent clause on the left, and an independent clause on the right side of it. All right. Thirdly, you could join 2 independent clauses using a comma conjunction. So conjunctions are, joining words, and we have an acronym that helps us remember these. You may recall something called fanboys. Anytime you have 2 independent clauses, you use a comma followed by a fanboy. Of course, not all of them would work. Just use the one that would work. For example, comma, and. A stands for and. Or we could go, she worked out, so she went to class. So S stands for so. And the rest of these, if you don't remember, are for, and, nor, but, or, yes, and so. More on that later. But so far, we've seen 3 ways we can correctly punctuate 2 independent clauses. Using a period between them, a semicolon where you have to have an independent clause on the left, independent clause on the right. And the third way is a comma fanboy. We just choose to go with so, but any other fitting one would work as well. So the fourth way we could combine 2 independent clauses is we could use a colon. Now a colon, we're going to park it here for a minute just to have a little bit more of a discussion on how to use colons. One thing I want us to be aware of is we have to have an independent clause on the left side. before we use a colon. Now, after that, as you can see, we can have an independent clause on the left and have another independent clause on the right. So we could do independent clause on the left, independent clause on the right. We could also have an independent clause here on the left, put a colon, and just have one word. I'll give you an example of this. When Mercy heard unfamiliar noises coming from the kitchen, she was overcome with one overwhelming feeling: fear. So you see the beginning of this sentence was a full thought, and it ends with one word, which is to complete what was just said. What is the one overwhelming emotion that Mercy felt? That is fear. So you could have an independent clause on the left and one word. You could also have an independent clause and have a list of items after this. So if you're listing items more than 3, you could use a colon right before it. So with that said, if you just pause for a moment and really think about this, we're really saying, as long as you have an independent clause on the left side, you can put a colon, and you can really put anything after that. And that's just a quick way to remember how to punctuate for independent clauses. Now, like I said, we're going to be delving deeper into how to use semicolons and commas and also colons. But for now, that's what I wanted you to see. So let's actually go ahead and summarize what we just saw. All right, so like we said, for you to be able to separate two independent clauses, you can use either a period, as long as you have an independent clause on the left and an independent clause on the right. So a full thought or an independent clause on the left, independent clause on the right, you can separate using a period. I hope you're writing these notes down. All right, so the second thing we said is for you to be able to use a semicolon, you have to have an independent clause on the left and an independent clause on the right. No excuses. It has to be that way. Independent clause on the left and an independent clause on the right to be able to use that semicolon. More on that semicolon later. All right, the third thing that we saw is to be able to use a comma fanboy, you need an independent clause on the left and you bring a comma fanboy. Remember, you can't just use a comma. That would be a mistake. That would be the comma splice. If you have two independent clauses, you use a comma fanboy. So a full sentence on the left, comma fanboy, a full sentence to the right of that. And the fourth way that we saw is you can join two independent clauses using a colon. And this is the most versatile one because you can have an independent clause on the left and anything on the right. By anything we said, we can have another independent clause. We could have a list. We could have one word. Basically, anything works after you have a full thought and a colon. And that concludes this lesson on comma splice.